The sun was a heavy, golden blanket pressing down on the vast, empty landscape of rural Arizona. For miles, there was little more than shimmering asphalt, stubborn desert shrubs, and the distant, jagged silhouettes of mountains. It was in this magnificent, lonely expanse that a classic sky-blue convertible carved its path, a splash of cheerful color against the muted tans and browns. Behind the wheel, a woman with a red bandana tied over her hair and large sunglasses, hiding her face, felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in a very long time. This wasn't the famous actress on a set, surrounded by lights and people telling her where to stand. This was just a person driving a car, feeling the wind. She loved this car, an old machine with a soul. It didn't have the fancy screens and quiet hum of a modern vehicle. It rumbled and growled with a personality all its own, and she could feel every vibration of the road through the steering wheel. The radio, an ancient piece of equipment, was tuned to a classic rock station, and a song from a decade before she was even born was playing loudly. She didn't know all the words, but she sang along anyway, her voice carried away by the wind, a happy, off-key sound that was only for her. This was the whole point of the trip, to escape. Not from something bad, but towards something simple. Towards silence and anonymity. For years, her life had been a constant cycle of early mornings, bright lights, and learning lines. It was a world of constant noise, of expectations, of smiling when she was tired and being on all the time. She loved her work, truly she did, but it was like wearing a very heavy, very beautiful coat all the time. Every now and then she just needed to take it off and feel the air on her skin. So, she had told her team she was taking a few weeks for herself. No specific destination. Just a map, a full tank of gas, and the open road. She had packed a single bag, left the designer clothes at home, and chosen worn-in jeans and soft cotton shirts. The bandana and sunglasses were her disguise, but they were also a uniform for this new, temporary identity. She was just a traveler, a wanderer. No one looked twice at a woman in an old car driving through the middle of nowhere. Hours passed like this, the scenery a slow, repeating painting of desert beauty. She saw a lone buzzard circling high in the sky, a patient predator. She saw herds of pronghorn antelope grazing far from the road, lifting their heads as she passed before returning to their meal. It was a world that felt ancient and untouched, and it made her own problems and worries feel very small and far away. The hum of the tires on the pavement was a kind of meditation, a rhythm that seemed to sync up with her heartbeat. Slowing everything down, just as she was beginning to think about finding a place to stop for a break, she saw it. It wasn't a town, not even close. It was just a single building, standing alone like a lonely sentinel in the middle of all that emptiness. A large, slightly faded sign announced it as Marty's Eatery. The neon letters, designed to glow a welcoming red and blue at night, were dark in the bright afternoon sun. A handful of massive 18-wheeler trucks were parked haphazardly in the gravel lot, their engines cooling with loud ticks and pops. It was the kind of place that had been there for 50 years and would probably be there for 50 more. A refuge for the road-weary. She hesitated for only a moment. Part of her wanted to just keep driving, to stay in her own little bubble of wind and music. But another part, the part that was starting to feel a bit stiff and thirsty, was drawn to the promise of a cold drink and maybe a piece of homemade pie. This was exactly what the trip was about: spontaneous decisions, small moments. She slowed the car, the engine's happy purr softening to a low grumble. As she turned off the highway and crunched across the gravel parking lot, she parked a convertible next to a dusty pickup truck and killed the engine. The sudden silence was deafening. The music was gone, the wind was gone, and all that was left was the quiet hum of the desert and the ticking of her own cooling engine. She sat for a moment, just breathing it in. Then, with a sigh of contentment, she swung her legs out of the car and stood up, stretching her back. The air was hot and dry, smelling of dust and hot metal. As she walked towards the diner's entrance, she glanced at her reflection in the greasy glass of the door. The woman looking back was a stranger. Tan skin, a few freckles across her nose from the sun, and eyes completely hidden behind the dark lenses of her sunglasses. She smiled. The disguise was perfect. She was just another face. Another traveler stopping for a bite to eat. She pushed the door open and a small bell tinkled, announcing her arrival. The air inside was a complete contrast to the dry heat outside. It was cool and thick with the delicious, comforting smell of fried food, fresh coffee, and something sweet like cinnamon or apple pie. The diner was exactly as she had imagined it from the outside. A long counter with worn red stools, a few booths lined up against the windows, and tables scattered in the middle. The floor was a black and white checkerboard pattern, scuffed and dull with years of use. A couple of men in dusty trucker caps sat at the far end of the counter, hunched over their coffee, speaking in low tones. A family with two tired-looking kids occupied a booth, quietly eating their burgers. There was an empty stool at the counter. As she made her way towards it, the worn solace of her boots making soft sounds on the floor, she slid onto the stool, the red vinyl creaking slightly under her weight. A woman with a tired but kind face and her hair pulled back in a messy bun walked over, wiping her hands on her apron. She didn't recognize her. Of course she didn't. The woman just saw a customer. "What can I get for ya, hun?" the waitress asked, her voice a little raspy. She looked up at the menu board, which was handwritten in white chalk. "Just a coffee, please," she said, her own voice sounding a little rusty from disuse. "And a slice of that apple pie, if it's as good as it smells." The waitress let out a small, genuine laugh. "It's better. Marty's been making it the same way for 30 years. Comin' right up." As the waitress poured the coffee into a thick, white ceramic mug, she felt a profound sense of relief settle over her. This was it. This was the simple, real moment she had been searching for. No one was asking for an autograph. No one was staring at her with a look of recognition. She was just a woman in a bandana about to drink coffee and eat pie in a dusty roadside diner. She wrapped her hands around the warm mug, letting the heat seep into her palms, and watched the world outside through the large window beside her. The desert sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. It was beautiful. It was peaceful. It was perfect. For the first time in a long time, she felt completely and totally free. The peace was a fragile thing, and it shattered not with a crack, but with a deep, guttural roar. It started as a low rumble, a vibration she felt more in her chest than heard with her ears. At first, it was just another sound of the highway, a distant truck perhaps. But it grew louder, more complex, a symphony of powerful engines all tuning to the same aggressive note. The sound swallowed the quiet hum of the desert and the tinny music from the old radio. It was a physical presence, a wave of pressure that rolled across the parking lot and seemed to seep through the walls of the diner. The waitress, who had just placed a slice of golden brown apple pie in front of her, paused mid-motion. Her friendly, tired expression tightened with a flicker of apprehension. The two truckers at the end of the counter, who had been speaking in low, gravelly voices, fell completely silent. They didn't look at each other. They just stared down into their coffee mugs as if hoping to become invisible. The family in the booth huddled a little closer together, the father instinctively putting a protective arm around his daughter's shoulder. The entire atmosphere of the room, which moments ago had been so warm and lazy, had snapped taut with a sudden collective anxiety. She turned her head to look out the large window. A cloud of dust was rising from the highway, and within it a fleet of dark shapes was emerging. One by one, then in a sudden flood, a dozen motorcycles roared into the gravel lot. They weren't the sleek, polished bikes of weekend enthusiasts. These were heavy, muscular machines, all black and chrome, customized and worn. They looked like predators, and their riders matched them perfectly. Clad in faded denim, black leather, and heavy boots, they were a formidable sight. They dismounted in a chorus of metallic clanks and the thud of heavy boots on gravel. They were a rough-looking crew, their faces weathered by sun and wind, many sporting thick beards and tattoos that snaked up their arms and necks. The patches on the backs of their vests were a mix of grim reapers, fiery skulls, and cryptic symbols that spoke of a world far removed from this lonely desert diner. For a moment, They just stood there, a gang of silhouettes against the setting sun, talking and laughing amongst themselves. Their voices were loud, carrying easily through the thin walls. Then, as if on a silent command, they started moving towards the entrance. The little bell above the door, which had sounded so cheerful when she arrived, now tinkled with a sense of dread as the first one pushed it open. The space, which had felt spacious a moment ago, suddenly felt small and cramped. They filed in, their sheer bulk filling the room. The air, once thick with the smell of coffee and pie, was now overwhelmed by the scent of hot leather, exhaust fumes, and stale cigarette smoke. They didn't sit down quietly. They moved with a loud, unapologetic confidence, scraping stools across the floor, slamming their helmets on the counter, and shouting their orders at the now visibly frightened waitress. The low chatter of the diner was completely gone, replaced by the boisterous, dominant noise of the new arrivals. She kept her head down, her eyes focused on her coffee. Her heart was starting to beat a little faster, a frantic drum against her ribs. She told herself to stay calm. They were just people stopping for a meal, just like her. But every instinct screamed that this was different. This was an invasion. She pulled her bandana a little lower over her forehead and adjusted her sunglasses, hoping to sink further into anonymity. She took a sip of her coffee, but it tasted bitter now, the warmth doing nothing to stop the cold feeling that was spreading through her chest. At first, they didn't seem to notice her. They were too caught up in their own world, laughing loudly, backslapping each other, and complaining about the heat. She allowed herself a tiny sliver of hope that she might just be another piece of the furniture to them, an anonymous woman in a corner. But then it happened. A pair of eyes, sharp and knowing, locked onto hers from across the room. It was one of the younger men, clean-shaven, but with a cold, hard look in his eyes. He had been staring at her for a long moment, his head tilted to the side. A slow smile spread across his face, a smile of discovery, not warmth. He leaned over and whispered something to the man sitting next to him. A large, burly man with a thick, dark beard and a patch that read Sergeant-at-Arms on his vest. The bearded man followed his gaze, his eyes narrowing as he looked directly at her. The whisper spread through the group like a virus. One by one, they stopped their own conversations and turned to look. The low roar of their voices faded into a series of hushed murmurs. They weren't just looking at a woman in a diner anymore. They were looking at her. They had seen past the bandana and sunglasses. They had recognized the famous face hiding in plain sight. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. It was like being under a spotlight, 100 invisible eyes all trained on her at once. The anonymity she had cherished so much was gone, shattered in an instant. The whispers grew louder, and she could catch snippets of her name, of movie titles, of crude jokes. What had been simple recognition was quickly curdling into something else, something predatory and possessive. Two of them stood up and moved towards the counter. They didn't sit in the empty stools far away from her. They took the ones right on either side, boxing her in. The man on her left smelled of sweat and cheap beer. He didn't look at her, but he leaned his heavy elbow on the counter, his arm just inches from hers, a clear act of marking territory. The man on her right was the one who had recognized her first. He leaned in close, too close, his voice a low, conspiratorial whisper that was somehow more threatening than a shout. "Well, well, well, well," he said, his breath hot against her ear. "Look what we have here. A movie star slumming it in a place like this? You lost, honey?" She didn't answer. She just stared straight ahead, her knuckles white where she gripped her coffee mug. Her mind was racing, frantically searching for an exit strategy. The door was blocked. The window was too high. Her car keys were in her pocket, but it felt like a million miles away. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but her legs felt like they were made of lead. Her silence only seemed to amuse them. Another one came over, standing behind her so close she could feel the heat from his body. He rested his hands on the back of her stool, leaning over her shoulder to look down at her half-eaten pie. "Not hungry anymore, Princess?" He chuckled. The others in the group laughed with him, a low, ugly sound. The comments grew bolder, more personal. They weren't just talking about the character she had played. They were talking about her. Their words were designed to intimidate, to strip away her dignity and make her feel small and powerless. The world had shrunk to the space between these men. The sounds of the diner, the other patrons, even the roar of the engines outside, all faded into a dull, distant hum. All she could hear was their breathing, their voices, the scraping of their boots on the floor. They had created a cage around her with their bodies, and the bars were closing in. A knot of pure, cold dread tightened in her stomach. She was alone, she was isolated, and she was surrounded. The air in the diner had grown thick and heavy, hard to breathe. It felt like she was underwater, the sounds of the bikers' laughter and taunts muffled and distorted by the pressure of her own fear. Her coffee had gone cold, the pie a forgotten, sad-looking lump on its plate. Every muscle in her body was coiled tight, ready for a fight or a flight, but she was trapped. The man on her left had shifted his weight, his leg now pressed against hers, a solid, immovable wall of denim and muscle. The one behind her was still leaning over her shoulder, his presence a suffocating weight. She could feel his eyes on the back of her neck. The world had shrunk to the size of a bar stool, and the walls were closing in. She tried to focus on something else, anything else. The crack in the vinyl on the counter. A fly buzzing lazily against the window. The reflection of the fluorescent lights in her dark sunglasses. But it was no use. Her senses were overwhelmed by them. The smell of their leather jackets, a mix of old sweat and road dust. The low rumble of their voices as they continued their crude commentary, their words like little stones being thrown at her. She thought of her car sitting so innocently just outside the window. It represented freedom and escape, but it might as well have been on the moon. Her keys felt like a useless piece of metal in her pocket. She was completely at their mercy, and the terrifying thought that they might have none sent a fresh wave of ice through her veins, the man who had first recognized her. The one with the cold, hard eyes leaned in even closer. His voice was a slimy whisper, meant only for her. "You know, we're big fans. We've seen all your movies. It's a shame you're not so tough in real life, huh?" He chuckled, a dry, rasping sound that scraped at her nerves. "Maybe we should get an autograph. A real personal one." His friend snickered in agreement. The threat was no longer implied. It was hanging in the air between them, thick and ugly. She squeezed her eyes shut for a second, a silent prayer for a miracle. For anything to break this nightmare. And then a new sound cut through the suffocating tension. It was an engine, but it was different. It wasn't the loud, aggressive, chest-thumping roar of the bikers' hogs. This was a cleaner, more focused sound, a high-pitched whine that was somehow both powerful and refined. It grew louder quickly, a sharp blade slicing through the dull rumble of the diner. The bikers' conversations faltered, their heads turning instinctively towards the window, their predatory expressions momentarily replaced by ones of annoyance and curiosity. Even the men surrounding her paused, their attention diverted. A single motorcycle, dark and sleek, shot into the parking lot. It didn't lumber and crunch over the gravel like the others. It glided, stopping with a precise, almost silent efficiency. It was a machine built for speed, not for intimidation, and its elegance was a stark contrast to the brutish choppers parked around it. The rider was dressed simply in black jeans and a dark, worn jacket, nothing flashy. He sat on the bike for a moment, perfectly still, looking at the diner. There was an unnerving calm about him, a stillness that felt more powerful than any loud display. Inside, the bikers watched with a mixture of suspicion and irritation. One of them muttered something under his breath. The man who had been whispering to her straightened up, his focus now split between her and this new, unexpected arrival. She felt a tiny sliver of space open up around her, a millimeter of breathing room. Her heart was still hammering against her ribs, but now it was with a flicker of something else. Hope? It was too soon to tell, but the dynamic had shifted. The rider swung his leg over the bike and dismounted in one smooth, fluid motion. He moved with an easy grace, his boots making soft crunching sounds on the gravel as he walked towards the diner's entrance. He didn't swagger or stomp. He just walked. As he pushed the door open, the little bell tinkled again, but this time the sound was different. It wasn't a sound of dread. It was a question mark. He stepped inside, and the entire room seemed to hold its breath. He was of average height, with a lean build, but he carried himself with a quiet confidence that filled the space. He ignored the glares from the bikers, his eyes scanning the room calmly before coming to rest on the counter. He walked towards it, his path taking him directly past the group of menacing men. They didn't move, but their eyes followed him. Their bodies tensing like wolves watching a rival enter their territory. He stopped a few feet away from her, on the other side of the biker who had been whispering to her. He still wore his helmet, a full-face black visor that hid his features completely, turning him into an anonymous, unreadable figure. He stood there for a moment, the silence in the room so thick you could feel it. The waitress, who had been cowering by the coffee machine, looked at him with wide, frightened eyes. He raised a hand, not in a threatening way, but just to get her attention. When he spoke, his voice was muffled by the helmet but clear and calm. "Just a water, please." The request was so normal, so utterly mundane, that it was shocking. It was like hearing a nursery rhyme in the middle of a battlefield. The bikers exchanged confused glances. They had been geared up for a confrontation, a challenge, a fight. They had no script for this. This man was acting as if he had just walked into a perfectly normal diner on a Tuesday afternoon, completely oblivious to the toxic atmosphere. The waitress, seeming to draw a little strength from his calm demeanor, nodded shakily and grabbed a plastic bottle and a glass from a cooler. As she placed it on the counter, the man reached up and removed his helmet. He shook out his dark hair, and the face that was revealed was one that the whole world knew. It wasn't just famous. It was familiar. It was the face of a man who had played heroes, dreamers, and assassins, a face that carried a certain kindness, a certain melancholy, a certain unshakable decency. It was the face of a friend. She saw it, and the world tilted on its axis. The fear that had been a cold, hard knot in her stomach didn't just loosen. It dissolved, replaced by a wave of relief so powerful it almost brought tears to her eyes. It was him. Of all the diners and all the desserts and all the world, he had walked into hers. He took a sip of his water, his eyes meeting hers over the rim of the glass. He gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod, a silent acknowledgement that said, "I see you. I'm here." Then he turned his head and looked at the biker closest to him, the one with the cold, hard eyes. He didn't glare or challenge him. He just looked at him with a simple, direct gaze. "Hey, man," he said, his voice now clear and natural. "How's it going?" The biker was taken completely off guard. He opened his mouth, then closed it, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. He had expected a fight, a demand, an insult. He hadn't expected a polite, almost friendly question. Fine," he grunted, looking away. Keanu's gaze then shifted back to her. The whole room was watching, the bikers, the waitress, the family hiding in their booth. He looked at her with a gentle concern that was more disarming than any weapon. "Sandy, you okay?" The nickname. It was a key turning a lock. It was a signal to everyone in the room that this wasn't a random stranger stepping in. This was a friend. This was someone who knew her, someone who cared for her. The power dynamic in the room had just performed a complete flip. The bikers were no longer the predators surrounding a lone victim. They were now the ones being watched, judged by a man whose quiet presence suddenly seemed to fill the entire diner. He didn't wait for her answer. He already knew it. He looked back at the group, his expression still calm, still reasonable. There was no anger in his voice, no threat, just a simple, unshakable statement of fact. "I think my friend is ready to get back on the road," he said softly, his eyes moving from one man to the next. "Mind if we let her do that?" The words hung in the air, delicate and yet impossibly heavy. Mind if we let her do that? It wasn't a question. It was a statement wrapped in the thinnest layer of politeness. The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum where all sound and movement ceased to exist. It was the kind of quiet that presses in on you, that makes you aware of the blood rushing in your own ears. The man who had been whispering to her, the one with the cold eyes, was frozen, his mouth slightly agape. He looked like a machine that had been given a command it couldn't process. All eyes were on the leader, the burly man with the thick, dark beard. He was the anchor of this storm, the one who had set the tone. His face, which had been a mask of cruel amusement, was now a canvas of conflicting emotions. There was surprise, confusion, and a slow-burning anger. This stranger, this movie star, had just walked into his world and flipped it upside down without raising his voice, without throwing a punch. He had used nothing but calm words and a steady gaze, and it was more disarming than any weapon. The leader's eyes flickered from Keanu's patient face to the woman sitting between his men. He saw the fear in her posture, but he also saw a new flicker of something else in her eyes. Hope. He then glanced at his own crew. They were looking at him, waiting for a cue. They were a pack, and he was the alpha. In this moment, his response would define him, not just to these strangers, but to the men who followed him. To back down now would be to show weakness. To escalate would be unpredictable. This man wasn't like the others they intimidated. He wasn't scared. He was just waiting. The leader took a slow, deliberate breath, the air whistling slightly through his nostrils. He sized Keanu up, trying to find a crack in the calm facade, a hint of fear he could exploit. But there was nothing. Keanu just stood there, holding his water bottle, his expression open and unreadable. He wasn't challenging the leader's authority. He was simply presenting an alternative reality, one where this woman was allowed to leave. It was a quiet, unshakable refusal to participate in their game of intimidation. And in that moment, something shifted. The leader looked around the diner again. He saw the waitress, her eyes wide with terror, clutching a coffee pot like a weapon. He saw the family in the booth, the father trying to shield his children, who were peeking over the table with wide, frightened eyes. He saw the two truckers who had been quietly observing everything, their hands resting near their phones, ready to call for help. The scene, which had moments ago felt like their personal playground, now felt like a stage. And they were the villains. The fun was gone. The thrill of the power trip had evaporated, replaced by the sudden sour taste of consequences. This wasn't worth it. Tormenting one woman wasn't worth the potential for a real fight, for police involvement, for the kind of trouble that followed you for a long, long time. The man in front of him wasn't just a person. He was a symbol. A famous face. Harming him, or even the woman with him, would bring a world of hurt down on their club. A muscle twitched in the leader's jaw. He made his decision. It was a quiet, internal surrender, but it was a surrender nonetheless. He broke eye contact with Keanu, looking down at the scuffed floor for a split second. It was a small gesture, but it was everything. It was the acknowledgement of defeat. He then looked at the man on the woman's left and gave a barely perceptible jerk of his head. It wasn't a shout or a command. It was a quiet, dismissive order. The man next to her hesitated for a heartbeat. Then, with a resentful sigh, he slid off the stool. The movement was clumsy, loud. He scraped the heavy metal leg across the floor, the sound grating in the quiet room. He took a few steps back, joining the others near the door. The man who had been behind her did the same, melting back into the group. The path to the exit was clear. The air in the room began to change. The suffocating pressure started to lift, replaced by a sullen, heavy stillness. The bikers didn't leave, but they were no longer a threat. They were just a group of men, standing around, looking sheepish and angry. The leader turned his back on the counter, staring out the window as if the desert outside was suddenly the most interesting thing he had ever seen. The confrontation was over. She felt the tension drain from her body so quickly it made her feel dizzy. Her shoulders, which had been hunched up around her ears, slowly relaxed. She took a deep, shaky breath, the first real one she felt she'd taken since they had surrounded her. It was like breaking the surface after being underwater for too long. She looked at Keanu, and he was already looking at her, his expression soft with a gentle concern. That was more comforting than any words could be. He didn't say anything else to the bikers. He didn't need to. He placed his water bottle on the counter with a soft click. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet. He took out a few bills and placed them on the counter, enough to cover her untouched pie and coffee and a generous tip for the terrified waitress. It was a quiet act of kindness, a way of restoring some normalcy to the shattered atmosphere of the diner. Then he moved. He walked around the counter and stood beside her. He didn't touch her, not yet. He just stood there, a solid, reassuring presence. She slid off the stool, her legs feeling a little wobbly. As she found her footing, he gently placed a hand on the small of her back. It wasn't a push or a pull. It was just a light, warm pressure, a silent message of support and guidance. "Let's go," he said softly, his voice just for her. She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Together they walked towards the door. Every step felt like a mile. She could feel the biker's eyes on her, their stares a mix of anger and grudging respect. She kept her head up, her gaze fixed on the door, on the promise of the world outside. Keanu's hand on her back was her anchor, the one thing that kept her from breaking into a terrified run-dot as they reached the door. The waitress gave her a small, trembling smile of gratitude. Keanu gave the woman a slight nod in return. He pushed the door open, and the little bell tinkled one last time. The cool evening air hit her face, carrying the scent of dust and desert sage. It was the sweetest thing she had ever smelled. They stepped out of the darkness of the diner and into the fading orange light of the setting sun. They were out. They were safe. And the open road was waiting. The cool evening air was a shock to her system, like stepping out of a stuffy, overheated room into the crispness of first snow. It filled her lungs, clean and sharp, chasing away the stale scent of fear and fried food that had clung to her inside. The little bell on the diner door gave one last, cheerful tinkle, a sound that now seemed to mark the end of a terrible dream. They were standing in the fading light, the sky a masterpiece of deep orange and soft purple, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the quiet ticking of her car's engine as it cooled and the distant, lonely call of a bird in the desert. She could feel the adrenaline leaving her body, and in its place came a profound and bone-deep weariness. Her hands, which had been clenched into tight fists, began to tremble. She stuffed them into her pockets, hoping he wouldn't notice, but of course he did. He noticed everything. His gaze was gentle, not pitying, but full of a quiet understanding that was more comforting than any grand speech could ever be. He didn't rush her. He just stood there, a solid, steady presence, giving her the time she needed to piece herself back together. She looked at him, really looked at him. The familiar face, the kind eyes that held a universe of stories and a deep, unshakable calm. In that moment, he wasn't a movie star, and she wasn't an actress. They were just two people, standing in a parking lot in the middle of nowhere, connected by a shared, terrifying experience and a friendship that had just proven to be as real and as solid as the ground beneath their feet. "Thank you," she finally managed to say. Her voice came out as a whisper, thin and shaky. It felt like an inadequate word, a tiny pebble thrown against the mountain of what she was feeling. It wasn't just for showing up. It was for the way he did it. For the quiet authority, the complete lack of ego, the simple, decent humanity that had disarmed an entire room without a single threat. He just shrugged. A small, almost self-conscious gesture. "Of course," he said, his voice low and natural. Then he added a single word that meant everything. "Always." It wasn't a promise for the future, but a statement about the past and the present. It was the foundation of their friendship, a quiet agreement that they would be there for each other, no matter what. It was the same feeling she had when they worked together all those years ago. A sense of mutual respect and easy camaraderie that had never really faded. Even with the passing of time and the demands of their separate lives, she took another deep breath, this one steadier. She felt like she could finally stand on her own 2 feet again. She pulled her keys from her pocket, her fingers still fumbling slightly. I should get going. Find a hotel for the night." He nodded, his eyes scanning the darkening highway ahead. "I'll follow you," he said. It wasn't a question, and it wasn't open for debate. It was a simple statement of fact, delivered with the same calm certainty as everything else he had done that evening. You don't have to do that, she protested, though she was secretly relieved. I'm fine now, really. I know, he said, meeting her eyes again. A small, reassuring smile touched his lips. But I'm going to. Just to make sure you get there safe. There was no argument to be had. It wasn't about her being weak. It was about him being a good friend. It was an act of care, pure and simple. She nodded, unable to argue, not really wanting to. Okay, they walked towards their respective vehicles. His sleek, dark motorcycle and her classic, sky-blue convertible, two very different machines, but in that moment they felt like two parts of a whole. He waited until she had unlocked her door and slid into the driver's seat before he swung his leg over his bike. He put on his helmet, once again becoming the anonymous rider, and she knew it was a deliberate choice. He was done being the center of attention. He was just her escort now. She started the engine, and the familiar rumble was a comforting sound. He started his bike, the high-pitched whine a sharp contrast. She pulled out of the parking lot and onto the empty highway, and a moment later his single headlight appeared in her rearview mirror. He didn't ride right on her bumper, giving her plenty of space. He just stayed there, a steady, unwavering point of light behind her. The drive was surreal. The desert at night was a completely different world. The vast open spaces that had felt so freeing in the daylight now seemed dark and intimidating. The shadows were long and deep, and every shape by the side of the road looked like something it wasn't. But she wasn't afraid. She knew he was back there. His headlight was an anchor in the darkness, a constant reassurance that she was not alone. Her mind replayed the events in the diner, but now they felt distant, like a scene from a movie she had watched a long time ago. The fear was still there, a faint echo, but it was overshadowed by the overwhelming sense of gratitude. She thought about the way he had walked in, completely calm in the face of such hostility. He hadn't fought them with anger. He had disarmed them with decency. It was a lesson in strength, a reminder that true power doesn't need to shout. She drove for nearly an hour, the two of them moving through the silent, sleeping landscape. Finally, she saw the lights of a small town ahead, and with it the glowing sign of a motel. It was a simple, no-frills place, but to her, it looked like a palace. It looked like safety. She pulled into the parking lot, and he followed, parking his bike a discreet distance away. She turned off her engine, and the silence returned. But this time it was a peaceful, welcoming silence. He took off his helmet as she got out of her car. She walked over to him, the gravel crunching under her feet. "Thank you again," she said, her voice stronger now. "For everything." "Any time," he replied, his smile warm and genuine in the dim light. "You're all set here?" "Yeah, I'm all set," she said, gesturing towards the brightly lit motel office. "I think I can handle checking in from here." He chuckled softly. "Good, well, get some rest." "You too," she said. "Drive safe." He just nodded. They stood there for another moment, a comfortable silence between them. There was so much more to say, but none of it needed to be spoken out loud. They both understood. Then, with one last small nod, he put his helmet back on, swung his leg over his bike, and started the engine. With a quiet roar, he pulled out of the parking lot and disappeared into the night. She watched until his red taillight was swallowed by the darkness. Then she turned and walked towards the motel office, feeling the weight of the evening finally lift from her shoulders. The story wasn't about the bikers or the fear. It was about this. It was about a quiet arrival and a simple departure. It was about the unwavering light of a friend's headlight in the rearview mirror, a testament to the fact that even in the loneliest, darkest places, you are never truly alone.